April 9, 1979, Los Angeles. Inside the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, the 51st Academy Awards ceremony fills the theater with Hollywood glamour. But backstage, something remarkable is unfolding. John Wayne, Duke to those who knew him, is preparing for what would be his final public appearance. The audience that night had no idea what it took for him to walk out on that stage. Just 3 months earlier, surgeons had removed his stomach in a desperate attempt to stop the cancer that was consuming him. He'd lost over 30 pounds. He needed supplemental oxygen backstage just to breathe. And to fill out his tuxedo, to look like the John Wayne America expected to see, he wore a surgical wetsuit beneath his formal wear. When he finally walked into that spotlight, the entire audience rose to their feet. The ovation lasted several minutes. Some say it was the longest standing ovation in Oscar history. Standing there, gaunt but unbowed, Duke looked out at America one last time and delivered a line that could have come straight from one of his pictures.
Well, Oscar and I have something in common. Oscar first came to the Hollywood scene in 1928. So did I. We're both a little weather-beaten, but we're still here and plan to be around for a whole lot longer.
The audience laughed. They cheered. They believed him. But the truth was something different entirely. Within 10 weeks, the man who had become the face of America would be gone. This is the documented account of those final 63 days, and the life of the man who refused to let the legend flicker even as the light went out. We all know the silhouette. Now it's time to meet the man. To understand the iron will John Wayne showed on that stage in 1979, we have to travel back to where the grit was first forged. It began on May 26, 1907, in a small 2-room house in Winterset, Iowa. He was born Marion Robert Morrison, a name he would carry legally until the day he died. In 1914, after his father's drugstore business failed, the family was forced to move to the edge of the Mojave Desert in California. They settled on a homestead near Lancaster in a shack that lacked even a proper floor. It was a life of dirt and sun-baked struggle. By the age of 7, young Marion was already working. Every morning at 4 a.m., he would saddle his horse and ride into the desert darkness to deliver newspapers before school. It was here, hauling water and helping his family survive the desert, that he developed the work ethic that would later define his career. Surprisingly to some, the boy was also a straight-A student and served as class president at Glendale High. He was a thinker as much as he was a worker, but there was one thing he couldn't stand: his name. His constant companion during those years was a 100-pound Airedale Terrier named Duke. The local fireman in Glendale began a running joke. The dog was Big Duke and the boy was Little Duke. Marion preferred the dog's name so much that he adopted it for life. By 1925, he had become a star offensive tackle for the USC Trojans, wearing jersey number 24. He was headed for a law degree and a life of prestige. But history turned on a single afternoon at Newport Beach. While body surfing, a massive rogue wave slammed into his shoulder, shattering his collarbone. In an instant, his football scholarship was gone. His legal career was over. Desperate for money to stay in school, he took a job at Fox Film Corporation. Not as an actor, but as a prop boy moving furniture for $35 a week. He was a nobody in a town of stars. But he was about to meet a man who saw past the prop boy and into the silhouette of a legend. By 1928, Marion Morrison was a fixture on the Fox lot, but he was a man of the shadows. He was the one carrying the heavy mahogany tables, setting the lights, and staying out of the way of actors who were half his size, but twice as famous. He was making $35 a week, barely enough to cover his rent and the boots he was wearing out on the studio floors. But in the summer of 1929, the shadows shifted. Raoul Walsh, a director known for his eye for raw talent and his glass eye from a brush with a jackrabbit, was preparing for the first great sound Western, The Big Trail. Walsh didn't want a polished stage actor from New York. He wanted a man who looked like he had been carved out of the Sierra Nevada. One afternoon, Walsh watched a young prop boy effortlessly hoisting a massive crate over his shoulder. He saw the frame, the natural authority, and the way the camera seemed to naturally seek him out. He offered Marion $75 a week to lead a cast of hundreds across the Oregon Trail. But before the first frame was shot, the studio executives decided that Marion Morrison was a name that belonged on a library card, not a movie poster. Inside a smoke-filled boardroom, Walsh and the Fox studio heads traded names like poker chips. They almost settled on Anthony Wayne, a tribute to the Revolutionary War general. But Walsh shook his head. It sounded too Italian, too soft. They finally landed on John Wayne. The man who would become the legend wasn't even invited to the meeting. He simply showed up on set the next morning to find his identity had been rewritten by strangers. The Big Trail was a massive production, filmed in a widescreen format that was decades ahead of its time, but it was a colossal box office failure. The Great Depression had hit, and audiences weren't interested in sprawling epics. They wanted escapism. Just as quickly as he had been elevated, John Wayne was cast back down. He was no longer a leading man for a major studio. He was a freelancer in B-movie hell. For the next 9 years, between 1930 and 1939, Wayne lived a life that would have broken most men. He made over 80 low-budget westerns. These weren't films, they were quickies. They often filmed an entire movie in just 4 to 5 days, sometimes shooting scenes for 3 different movies at the same time to save money on horse rentals. He was making $105 a week, but he was doing all his own stunts. In the early 30s, there were no safety protocols. If the script called for a jump from a moving stagecoach or a fall from a cliff, Wayne did it. He was bruised, battered, and stuck in a cycle of Saturday matinees that played to half-empty theatres. It was a grueling, unglamorous apprenticeship, but it was during this decade of dust that the Duke we know was actually engineered. Wayne realized that his acting was stiff, so he turned to a man who became his closest professional ally, Yakima Canutt. Canutt was the greatest stuntman in history, a man who lived on the edge of death for a paycheck. Together, they revolutionized the Western. Before Wayne and Canutt, movie fights looked like a dance. They were clumsy and unbelievable. Canutt taught Wayne the passing punch, a technique where the fist passes close to the camera, creating the illusion of a devastating blow that never actually touches the other actor. But the most famous lesson wasn't about fighting. It was about walking. Wayne spent weeks observing Canutt's natural gait, a slow, rhythmic, rolling swagger that suggested a man was always balanced and always ready. Wayne practiced it until it became muscle memory. He wasn't just walking, he was creating a visual language of confidence that would eventually become his trademark across the globe. Yet, this decade of struggle held a secret he desperately tried to erase from the annals of history. In 1933, the singing cowboy craze was sweeping the nation. The studio, desperate for a hit, decided to turn the rugged Wayne into Singin' Sandy Saunders. There was only one problem. John Wayne couldn't sing a note. He was forced to stand in front of a microphone and lip-sync, while a man named Smith Ballew provided the smooth baritone voice. For a man who valued authenticity and grit above all else, the experience was a profound humiliation. In later years, as he became a multimillionaire, Wayne reportedly spent thousands of dollars trying to buy the original prints of those films just to keep them out of public view. He wanted the world to see a hero, not a fraud. For 9 long years, he waited for a second chance. He was a prop boy who had become a stuntman, who had become a B-movie drifter. He was 32 years old, his youth was fading, and his career seemed destined for the bargain bin of Hollywood history. For 9 long years, he waited for a second chance. He was waiting for a man who could take the prop boy's strength, the stuntman's walk, and the B-movie grit, and turn them into an icon. That man was the tyrannical, brilliant director John Ford, and their relationship would become a 50-year war for the soul of the American legend. If Yakima Canutt gave John Wayne his walk, John Ford gave him his soul. But it was a soul Ford first had to break. John Ford, known to his inner circle as Pappy, was a man of fierce contradictions. He was a brilliant 6-time Oscar winner who preferred the company of stuntmen to socialites. He was also a psychological predator who enjoyed finding a man's insecurities and picking at them until they bled. For 9 years, while Wayne was grinding out B-movies in the dust of Poverty Row, Ford watched from a distance. They spent their summers on Ford's yacht, the Arana, a 110-foot beacon of teak and brass. These weren't pleasure cruises, they were whiskey-soaked tests of character. Ford would invite his stock company, a loyal troupe of actors and crew, to sail to Mexico for weeks at a time. The rules were simple. Plenty of booze, no women allowed, and hours of high-stakes chess. Wayne was a master-level chess player. He would sit across from Ford for hours in the smoke-filled galley, the boat rocking in the Pacific swells, playing a game of mental attrition. It was on the Arana that Ford studied Wayne. He watched the way the younger man handled his liquor, the way he handled losing a queen, and the way he handled Ford's constant, biting insults. For nearly a decade, Wayne begged Ford for a real role. Ford always refused. He told Wayne he wasn't ready. He told him he was too green. He watched Wayne make 80 movies for other directors, letting him sharpen his craft in the shadows while Ford waited for the perfect moment to discover the man he had known for years. That moment came in 1939 with a script called Stagecoach. Ford didn't just decide to film in a location, he decided to create a myth. He took his crew to a remote, dirt-poor stretch of the Navajo Nation known as Monument Valley. There were no paved roads, no electricity, and no running water. The sand was so fine it got into the cameras and the food. But the towering red sandstone buttes provided a scale that matched John Wayne's frame. On the set, however, the atmosphere was toxic. Ford knew that Wayne was nervous. This was his first big-budget chance in 9 years. Instead of supporting him, Ford launched a campaign of psychological warfare. He called Wayne a big oaf and a dumb bastard in front of the entire cast. He mocked the way he moved his hands. He even went after Wayne's acting, asking him why he couldn't walk like a man instead of a fairy. The abuse was so calculated that the rest of the cast, including veteran star Claire Trevor, began to protest. But Ford wouldn't stop. He wanted Wayne frustrated. He wanted him angry. He wanted to strip away the B-movie habits and leave nothing but raw, instinctive grit. It worked. The world remembers the entrance. The camera zooms in fast, a technique almost unheard of at the time, onto the face of the Ringo Kid. He's standing in the desert heat, spinning a Winchester carbine with one hand like it weighs nothing at all. He has a lopsided grin and eyes that look like they've seen the end of the world. In that 1 second of film, the prop boy died and the icon was born. Stagecoach was a massive hit, and it turned Monument Valley into the spiritual home of the American Western. But while the film made John Wayne a star, it also solidified a dangerous pattern in his life. He had learned that to be a hero, you had to endure the pain. You had to take the hits, drink the whiskey, and never complain. It was a philosophy that would serve him well on screen, but it was about to collide with a global reality that would haunt his conscience for the rest of his life. Because while the Ringo Kid was conquering the box office, a real war was beginning, and the man who played the soldier better than anyone else was about to stay home. By the winter of 1941, John Wayne had finally reached the summit. He was 34 years old, the undisputed king of the Western, and the man who embodied the rugged promise of the American frontier. But on December 7th, the world changed. As the smoke rose over Pearl Harbor, Hollywood's leading men began to trade their tuxedos for uniforms. Jimmy Stewart, at the height of his fame, enlisted and eventually flew 20 combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. Henry Fonda, a father of 3, walked into a recruiting office and famously said, "I don't want to be in a fake war in a studio." But the man who played the soldier better than anyone else stayed in California. This is the great regret that would haunt John Wayne for the next 38 years. Technically, Wayne was classified as 3A, deferred because of family dependency. He had 4 children and a marriage that was already beginning to fray. But the paperwork was only the surface. The real weight holding him back was financial. Wayne was the primary asset for Republic Pictures, a Poverty Row studio that had gambled everything on his stardom. The studio's president, a ruthless businessman named Herbert Yates, saw the war not as a call to duty, but as a threat to his bottom line. Yates reportedly sat Wayne down and gave him an ultimatum. If he enlisted, Yates would sue him for breach of contract, strip him of his earnings, and ensure he never worked in Hollywood again. Wayne was caught in a vice. He wrote desperate letters to his mentor, John Ford, who was already a commander in the Navy's photographic unit. Wayne begged for a way into the service, asking for a spot where he could be useful. But Ford, perhaps seeing the value of Wayne's image on the home front, or perhaps enjoying the leverage he held over his protégé, didn't pull the strings. As the war progressed, Wayne's guilt began to manifest as a hyperfixation on war films. He made The Flying Tigers, The Fighting Seabees, and they were expendable. On screen, he was winning the war single-handedly. But the men in the mud knew the difference. In 1943, Wayne travelled to the South Pacific on a USO tour. He expected a hero's welcome. Instead, when he stepped onto a makeshift stage in the jungles of New Guinea to address thousands of battle-weary Marines, the silence was deafening. Then, the boos started. Real combat veterans, men who had seen their friends die on the beaches of Guadalcanal, looked at the bronzed, healthy movie star in a pristine uniform and saw a draft dodger. Wayne was devastated. He reportedly spent that night drinking alone in a tent, the sound of the jungle pressing in on him. He realized that no matter how many films he made, he could never buy back the 4 years he spent in the safety of a soundstage. It is no coincidence that after 1945, Wayne's politics became more aggressive and his patriotism more vocal. He wasn't just defending his country, he was compensating for a debt he felt he could never repay. By the early 1950s, this vocal anti-communism reached the ears of the Kremlin. Joseph Stalin, a man who understood the power of propaganda as well as any Hollywood mogul, reportedly became obsessed with the Duke. Stalin saw Wayne not as an actor, but as the primary ideological weapon of the United States. The Soviet leader believed that if he could destroy the symbol of American grit, he could break the American spirit. In 1951, a hit was authorized. Soviet archives and declassified FBI files reveal a plot that sounds like the very scripts Wayne used to reject. 2 KGB agents arrived in Los Angeles under deep cover, posing as FBI officials. They managed to infiltrate the Warner Brothers lot and entered Wayne's private office. But the real FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had been monitoring the chatter. They intercepted the assassins before a trigger was pulled. In a strange twist of history, Wayne reportedly asked the FBI not to arrest them immediately. He wanted to sit across the desk from the men sent to kill him. He looked them in the eye, told them he wasn't afraid of Stalin, and then handed them over to federal custody. From that moment on, the Duke lived as a man at war. He carried a loaded .38 snub-nose revolver in his pocket, even on film sets. He had a private security detail, and his home in Newport Beach was turned into a fortress. The threats followed him to the front lines of the Cold War. In 1966, while visiting troops in the middle of the Vietnam conflict, a sniper's bullet whistled past his head during a patrol. When his panicked security team tried to rush him to cover, Wayne allegedly refused to run. He stood his ground, looked toward the tree line, and waited. He had spent his life playing the man who stood tall. Now, whether it was KGB hitmen or a hidden sniper, he was determined that no one would ever see him flinch again. But while he was winning his battles in the public eye, a more insidious enemy was beginning to take hold, the 3-pack-a-day habit that was turning his lungs into ash, and a political climate that was about to turn the American hero into a figure of controversy. By the late 1940s, John Wayne had transcended the silver screen. He was no longer just a movie star, he had become a political institution, a self-appointed guardian of the American gates. The deep-seated guilt from his missing war years had forged a man who didn't just love his country. He patrolled it with the same intensity he brought to a cinematic showdown. He rose to become the president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. It was a title as imposing as the man himself, and Wayne wasn't a silent figurehead. He was the general of Hollywood's anti-communist movement. Alongside a loyal circle that included gossip columnist Hedda Hopper and his close friend Ward Bond, Wayne led a relentless charge to purge the industry of what he termed subversive elements. This was the era of the blacklist, a dark, paranoid chapter of American history where careers were ended with a whisper and a handshake in a smoke-filled room. Wayne believed he was a patriot protecting the nation's moral center, but to those on the receiving end of his influence, he was a man using his massive shadow to eclipse the lives of anyone he deemed un-American. He didn't just support the blacklist, he enforced its culture, famously stating that he had no regret for the people who found themselves unable to work in his town. His political reach extended far beyond the studio gates. Wayne worked in close strategic coordination with J. Edgar Hoover. Declassified FBI files from the era reveal a steady, private stream of communication between the Bureau and the Duke. Wayne wasn't merely an informant, he was a partner. Hoover viewed Wayne as the ultimate civilian recruitment tool for American values, and Wayne viewed the FBI as the only legitimate line of defense against the Red Menace he had been warned about by the highest levels of government. But as the 1950s faded into the radical, turbulent 1960s, the cultural ground began to shift beneath the Duke's boots. The silent generation that had worshipped him was being replaced by a youth culture that viewed his version of America as a relic. They questioned the wars he supported and the values he defended. Instead of retreating or softening his stance, Wayne doubled down. In 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War, he directed and starred in The Green Berets. It was a film designed with a singular purpose: to counter the growing anti-war movement and the negative news coverage coming out of Southeast Asia. To ensure the film's authenticity, Wayne wrote a personal letter to President Lyndon B. Johnson, requesting full military cooperation. The president agreed, granting Wayne access to equipment and personnel that few directors could ever dream of. While the critics panned the film as propaganda, it was a massive box office success, proving that his silent majority audience was still there, hungry for the old-fashioned heroism he provided. Then came the moment that would define his public controversy for decades to come. In 1971, at the age of 64, Wayne sat down for an extensive, wide-ranging interview with Playboy magazine. He spoke with the unfiltered, brutal bluntness of a man who believed his status made him untouchable. He discussed race, the history of the American frontier, and the changing social morals of Hollywood. The quotes were explosive. He spoke about his belief in white supremacy, until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility, and he dismissed the historical plight of Native Americans, famously suggesting they were selfishly trying to keep this land for themselves. To his loyal, older audience, these were the words of a man refusing to bow to a changing world. But to the rest of the nation, it was a moment where the mask of the hero slipped to reveal a man whose views were deeply out of step with the times. The Playboy interview didn't just cause a temporary stir, it became a permanent, documented stain on his legacy that continues to spark cancel culture debates over 40 years after his death. Yet, despite the polarizing headlines, Wayne possessed a rare, self-deprecating wit that could disarm even his fiercest detractors. In 1974, he was challenged by the students of the Harvard Lampoon to a roast. These were students who represented everything he despised, long-haired, radical, and anti-war. They expected him to be a grumbling, angry old man. Instead, John Wayne arrived at Harvard Square on top of a modified army tank, waving to the crowd with a lopsided grin. When a student asked him if he truly looked at himself as an American legend, Wayne didn't hesitate. He looked out at the hostile crowd and said, "I'm just a guy who's been lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time for 40 years. He didn't win them over by changing his mind or apologizing for his past. He won them over by being the most authentic version of the character he had created. He knew he was a dinosaur in a new world, but he refused to apologize for the size of his footprint." However, while he was fighting for the soul of the country in the headlines, his own personal life was a quiet battlefield of broken promises, failed marriages, and a family that struggled to live in the shadow of a man who was more the Duke than he was a father. To the world, John Wayne was the ultimate patriarch, the steady hand at the head of the table, the man who protected the home as fiercely as he protected the frontier. But inside the walls of his own homes, the reality was a tangled web of cultural clashes, explosive tempers, and a persistent, gnawing loneliness. The man who could lead an army on screen often found himself completely outmaneuvered by the women he loved. There was a singular, fascinating pattern to the Duke's romantic life. Every one of his 3 wives was of Latin descent. First came Josephine Sáenz, the daughter of a wealthy Panamanian consul. Then came Esperanza Chata Bauer, a former Mexican actress. Finally, there was Pilar Palet, the daughter of a Peruvian senator. Wayne was deeply enamored with Latin culture. He didn't just marry into it, he immersed himself in it. He was a man who spoke fluent Spanish, a fact that surprised many of his fans who saw him as the quintessential Anglo hero. On the set, he would often lapse into Spanish with the crew or his family, finding a sense of warmth and passion in the language that he felt was missing from the rigid Hollywood social circles. But while he loved the culture, he struggled with the reality of the independent, fiery women who came with it. His second marriage to Esperanza Chata Bauer was nothing short of a war zone. It was a relationship fueled by equal parts passion and high-proof alcohol. Chata was fiercely jealous of Wayne's career and his devotion to John Ford's stock company. She felt excluded from the masculine world of the Arana yacht and the remote film sets. The tension reached a terrifying climax one night in 1953. Wayne returned home late from a film wrap party, smelling of bourbon and perfume. Chata was waiting for him in the shadows of their darkened hallway, clutching a loaded .38 revolver. As Wayne walked through the door, she fired. The bullet whizzed past his head, burying itself in the wall just inches from where he stood. It was a moment that could have come straight from a film noir, but for Wayne, it was a wake-up call. He realized that the Duke persona, which commanded respect across the globe, carried no authority in his own hallway. The divorce that followed was a public scandal, filled with accusations of infidelity and violence that threatened to strip away the family man image he had worked so hard to build. By the time he married Pilar in 1954, Wayne was attempting to be a different kind of man. He wanted a sanctuary. He moved the family to a sprawling estate in Newport Beach, away from the gossip of Sunset Boulevard. He bought the Wild Goose, a 136-foot former WW2I minesweeper, and turned it into a floating home where he could escape the pressures of being an icon. But even in paradise, there were casualties. John Wayne had 7 children across his marriages, and for them, Dad was often a ghost. His son, Patrick Wayne, who followed him into acting, once remarked with a touch of sadness that his father was more Duke than Dad. When Wayne was home, he was a massive, looming presence who demanded order and discipline. But he was rarely home. He spent months at a time in the deserts of Mexico or the mountains of Utah, leaving his children to grow up watching their father on a cinema screen rather than at the dinner table. He was a man who preached traditional family values to the American public, while his own children struggled to find a connection with the legend they called father. This internal conflict, the gap between the hero on the marquee and the absent man in the photograph, created a private sorrow that Wayne rarely spoke of, but one that he carried into his final years. He was a man who had everything the world could offer: fame, wealth, and power. But as he entered the 1960s, he was about to face an enemy that couldn't be fought with a Winchester or a legal team. He was about to enter a battle for his very breath, a battle that would start in a remote, radioactive corner of the Utah desert. In the mid-1950s, John Wayne was at the peak of his power. He was the highest-paid actor in the world and the undisputed king of the box office. But in 1954, he made a decision that many historians now believe was a literal death sentence. He agreed to star in a film called The Conqueror, an epic about Genghis Khan. It was a role he was fundamentally miscast for, but the true tragedy of the film wasn't on the screen. It was in the soil beneath his feet. The production was filmed in Snow Canyon near St. George, Utah. What the cast and crew didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that they were working just 137 miles downwind from the Nevada National Security Site. Just 1 year earlier, the US government had detonated Harry, a 32-kiloton nuclear bomb so powerful it became known as Dirty Harry because of the immense amount of radioactive fallout it scattered across the region. The canyons were filled with a fine, rust-colored dust. It was in the air they breathed, the water they drank, and the food they ate. Wayne, ever the professional, ignored the warnings. Dopamine hit, the Geiger counter. There is a chilling story from the set that has since become a part of Hollywood lore. Wayne reportedly brought a Geiger counter with him to the location. As he moved it over the red rocks, the device began to click so rapidly and so loudly that he thought it was broken. He laughed it off, jokingly telling the crew that the machine was on the fritz. He continued to film, rolling in the dirt and filming intense battle scenes in the radioactive wind for weeks. But the radiation didn't stay in Utah. In an act of staggering corporate negligence, the studio, RKO Pictures, shipped 60 tons of that Utah dirt back to Hollywood. They dumped it onto a soundstage so they could film pickup shots in a consistent environment. For months, the cast and crew worked in a confined indoor space filled with the very dust that had been kissed by an atomic blast. The statistics that followed are haunting. Out of the 220 people who worked on that production, 91 of them would develop cancer. 46 of them would die from it, including the film's director Dick Powell and Wayne's co-stars Susan Hayward and Agnes Moorehead. Wayne's own battle, however, wouldn't become public for another decade. For 50 years, he had been a 5-pack-a-day smoker of unfiltered Camel cigarettes. He viewed the habit as an essential part of his masculine image. But by 1964, the cough he had dismissed as a cold turned into something far more sinister. In September of that year, surgeons at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles made a devastating discovery: a tumor the size of a golf ball in his left lung. In a grueling 6-hour surgery, doctors removed his entire left lung and 2 of his ribs. In the 1960s, a cancer diagnosis was often seen as a career ender, especially for a man whose brand was built on invincibility. His advisors urged him to keep it quiet, to tell the press it was an old injury or walking pneumonia. Wayne refused. He realized that his legendary status gave him a unique power. He broke the silence, held a press conference, and famously coined the term the Big C to describe his cancer. He wanted to take the stigma away from the disease, telling the public, "I licked the Big C and I'm going to be around for a long time." It was a moment of immense courage that solidified his bond with his 50-plus audience. They saw a man who wasn't just a hero on a horse, but a man who was fighting the same terrifying reality they were. To find peace during these years, Wayne retreated to the Wild Goose. He would spend weeks at sea, often sailing to the frigid waters of Alaska. He developed a peculiar legendary tradition. He would steer the massive yacht toward a glacier, send a crewman out in a small boat to chip off a 1,000-year-old hunk of glacial ice, and then use that ancient crystal-clear ice for his evening bourbon. It was a moment of quiet, icy dignity for a man who knew his time was becoming a precious commodity. But the Big C wasn't finished with him. The radioactive dust of Utah and the decades of tobacco were a slow-acting poison. By the late 1970s, the shadows were lengthening, and the iron will that had carried him through 100 cinematic battles was about to face its final 63-day countdown. We return to where we began, April 9th, 1979. When John Wayne stepped off the stage of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion after his final Oscar appearance, the adrenaline that had sustained him for those few minutes evaporated. He was rushed to a waiting car, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. The man the world had just cheered as weather-beaten was, in reality, a man whose internal systems were in a state of total collapse. 11 days later, on April 20th, the charade of health could no longer be maintained. He was admitted to the UCLA Medical Center under a cloud of secrecy. The official word was a bout of bronchitis, but the reality was a nightmare of metastatic cancer. The Big C had returned, and this time it had taken up residence in his stomach. This was the beginning of the final 63-day countdown, a period of time where the legend was slowly stripped away, leaving only the raw, defiant spirit of Marion Morrison. Inside the VIP wing of the hospital, Wayne was not a compliant patient. He treated the hospital ward like a film set where he was still the director. Despite being bedridden and hooked to a maze of plastic tubing, he demanded his slippers and his robe every morning. He refused to let the nurses see him in a state of disarray. Even as his weight plummeted to a skeletal frame, he insisted on walking the hallways. He would lean on his son Ethan's shoulder, his knuckles white as he gripped a rolling IV pole, shuffling down the linoleum corridors. He wasn't just exercising. He was proving to himself and to anyone watching that the Duke did not retreat. But the physical deterioration was relentless. By mid-May, the man who had once effortlessly hoisted 60-pound crates as a prop boy could no longer lift a glass of water to his own lips. His diet was reduced to ice chips and intravenous fluids. Dopamine hit, the experimental gamble. Desperate to stay in the fight, Wayne agreed to become a human guinea pig for a highly experimental and controversial drug called interferon. At the time, it was hailed as a magic bullet for cancer, but the side effects were brutal. It caused high fevers, agonizing bone pain, and extreme mental fog. Wayne endured it all without a word of complaint, telling his doctors, "If this can help the next guy, then do it." He was no longer fighting for his own life. He was fighting for the data that might save someone else's. During these weeks, the hospital room became a quiet, digital museum of 20th century history. The visitors who walked through that door represented the closing of an era. Jimmy Stewart came and sat by the bed for hours. They didn't talk about the war or the movies. They talked about their kids and the old days at the studio. Maureen O'Hara, his fiery co-star from The Quiet Man and his closest female friend, arrived to find him drifting in and out of sleep. She sat by his side, holding his hand, whispering to him in the silence. When she left, she told the family, "I just saw a lion die." There were no shows, too. Some of the political rivals he had sparred with for decades stayed away, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps because the sight of the falling titan was too much to bear. By the first week of June, the question loop of his survival was answered. The interferon had failed. The cancer had spread to his lymph nodes and his spine. The pain became so intense that he was placed on a heavy regimen of morphine, but he fought the sedation. He hated the mental fog. He wanted to be awake for the end. He spent his final conscious days looking out the window toward the Pacific Ocean, the same ocean where a rogue wave had changed his life 52 years earlier. He spoke to his children about legacy, about the importance of holding your ground, and about his one great fear, that he would be remembered only as a poster on a wall, and not as a man who had tried his best to be decent. Dopamine hit, the final 24 hours. On June 10th, the Duke slipped into a coma. The hospital wing was cleared of everyone except his immediate family. His son Patrick, his daughter Isa, and his third wife Pilar stood vigil. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the machines that were now doing the work his body could no longer manage. The man who had survived KGB assassins, atomic dust, and 9 years of Hollywood exile was now facing the only enemy he couldn't outdraw. He had lived for 26,315 days. He had made 175 films. He had become the face of a nation. But as the sun began to set over the California coast on June 11th, the silhouette was finally ready to merge with the dark. The end came at 5:35 p.m. on June 11th, 1979. In the quiet of his room at the UCLA Medical Center, the man who had been the Duke for half a century finally let go. His daughter, Asa, was holding his hand. In his final conscious moment, she whispered to him, asking if he knew who she was. He squeezed her hand, looked her in the eye, and spoke his final words. "Of course I know who you are. You're my girl. I love you." It was a simple, tender departure for a man whose life had been defined by epic scale. But even as the heart of Marion Morrison stopped beating, the story of John Wayne refused to settle into the history books. In the days following his death, the world learned of a final, private transformation. On June 9th, just 48 hours before he passed, the lifelong Protestant and fierce individualist had requested a priest. Influenced by his 3 Catholic wives and his 7 children, he was baptized into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. The American Chronicle of John Wayne didn't end with a showdown. It ended with a quiet moment of grace and a search for peace. The nation's reaction was unprecedented. President Jimmy Carter, a man who stood on the opposite end of the political spectrum from Wayne, issued a statement that captured the sentiment of the 50-plus generation. In an age of few heroes, he was a genuine one. Yet, as the public mourned, a strange and final mystery began to unfold. Wayne was buried at Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar, overlooking the ocean he loved. But for 20 years, the site remained a blank patch of grass. There was no headstone. There was no name. His family had intentionally left the grave unmarked to protect it from vandals and souvenir hunters who they feared would disturb his final rest. For 2 decades, fans wandered that cemetery looking for the King of the West and finding only silence. It wasn't until 1999 that a simple bronze plaque was finally installed. The words chosen for that plaque weren't from a script or a political speech. They were the words Wayne himself had once suggested during a quiet moment years earlier. He wanted an old Mexican proverb, one that reflected the threefold nature of his character. It reads, feo, fuerte y formal. ugly, strong, and dignified. It was the ultimate dopamine hit of self-awareness. He knew he wasn't a pretty boy. He knew he was a man of power, and above all, he believed in the dignity of the individual. As we look back at the American Chronicles of John Wayne, we see a man who was far more than a silhouette. We see the boy who rode paper routes at 4 a.m. We see the prop boy who moved furniture for $35 a week. We see the man who carried the guilt of a missing war and the literal dust of an atomic blast in his lungs. He was a man who became a prisoner of his own reflection, playing a character so large that it eventually required a surgical wetsuit just to keep the myth standing for one last night in the spotlight. We began this journey at the 1979 Oscars, looking at a shadow on a curtain. We end it by realizing that the shadow was never the point. The point was the man who kept walking into the light, even when he knew the sun was going down. John Wayne didn't just play the hero. He showed us that the real battle isn't fought on a horse or in a movie. It's fought in the final 63 days, in the quiet of a hospital room, and in the legacy we leave behind when the credits finally roll. John Wayne spent 50 years and 175 films trying to capture the essence of the American combat soldier. But as the Duke himself once admitted, he was a man playing a part. He was the shadow of a reality he never personally touched. Yet, in the same Hollywood where Wayne built his legend, there was another man. He didn't have the height or the Hollywood swagger. He was a 5'5" sharecropper's son from Texas who became the most decorated soldier in the history of the United States. If John Wayne was the legend, Audie Murphy was the reality. To see the true story of the man who lived the war the Duke could only imagine, click here to watch our chronicle of Audie Murphy.